Hey guys, so today I wanted to rank all of the Survivor players that were under the age of 21 at the time of their seasons, and I thought this would be a fun video to make, and it was actually an idea suggested to me by Audrala, who is one of the members of my Discord server, so I wanted to give you a shout out there. But this video will be pretty straightforward. I'm going to be ranking every player that was under the age of 21 at the time of filming. And this is pretty interesting as something that gets talked about a lot when assessing players in the preseason, particularly young players, is life experience and whether players are going to be able to interact with different groups of people, whether they're going to be able to gain respect from older players through the moves that they're making, and whether they can pick up on certain cues that older players are more likely to pick up upon. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about how really young players have done historically on Survivor, as well as comparing them to each other. And this is actually pretty interesting as it's actually a relatively narrow field of only 17 players, and it's also a field that skews quite a bit towards more recent seasons, which makes sense given that earlier on in Survivor history, the minimum age to play was 21, and it was only after Survivor Micronesia that the age was lowered to 18. And with the exception of one player I'll be talking about later on, all these players have played from Tocantins onwards. And as a point of clarification for one player in particular, this will be looking at the season that they played in which they were under 21. This will not include any appearances that players have made after turning 21. But with all that out of the way, there are 17 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 17, the young player that I believe played the worst on their season is Keith from Survivor Edge of Extinction. And Keith is someone that was pretty mediocre, someone that didn't really have much of a shot coming into it. They were seen as a bit of a liability and a bit of an outcast early on. And while they did survive the Reen tribal and even voted correctly in that, Reen was also one of his closest allies. And at the very next tribal, he's voted out near unanimously due to him being such a liability and him not really having many allies in the game. And while he's able to get by a little bit on the edge, he didn't really have much of a shot of winning that challenge, and obviously he ends up quitting the game after the first edge challenge. So at the end of the day, Keith is someone that played pretty mediocrely. However, there's also a debate that he didn't really have much of a shot given how weak he was physically. But still, I feel like compared to all the other young players, he's probably the one with the least merit to his game, which is why he is here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and I did debate this next one as I feel like this person lasted a bit longer in the game than the next person we'll be talking about. However, this person also played really messy, but here we have JD from Survivor 41, and JD's kind of hard to assess because obviously, you have to talk about all of his messy gameplay during his time on UA, where first he lies about his trip to Shipwheel Island that causes people to be weary of him. You also have his handling of his extra vote, where he ends up giving it to Shan twice over the course of the season, and in general, he just trusts Shan way too much. And he obviously builds some not great relationships with the likes of Brad, Jeannie, and to a degree Ricard as well. However, the big pro to him is that he did survive 2 tribals at least, so I think that's something to consider at least. However, at the end of the day, he's still a very sloppy player and someone that probably wasn't super long for the game, especially with his overconfidence during a lot of it, which is why he is here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I actually consider putting this person a little bit higher considering the circumstances surrounding their boot. However, at the end of the day, they were still voted out very early, but here we have from David versus Goliath, Jessica PEET. And Jessica is someone that was obviously the first voted out of her tribe. However, even then it was due to weird circumstances, namely the fact that Pat was medevac, to where had that not happened, Pat or Nick would have been the first voted out of that tribe. And even then, her losing Pat is probably bad considering that Pat was more aligned with her side than anything else. And even coming into her boot round, she had a very solid alliance of her, B, Carl, and Davey, to where it ended up being a 5-4 vote. And while she was taken out in that spot, I don't think she did too much wrong to be voted out, and had Pat been around, she could have used him as a meat shield moving forward. I feel like Jessica didn't do as much wrong compared to Keith and JD, but at the end of the day, she was still a very early boot, which is why she is here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have a pretty interesting figure to talk about, but we actually have another new era player, and here we have SWATI from 42. And I actually got comments on my worst player of the new era video saying that SWATI should have been on the list, and while I think she played a pretty bad game, I don't think she's quite the worst. Where she seemed to be in a decent position early on, being able to build alliances with Tori and Zack while still having a solid relationship with Drea, and she does vote correctly at that first tribal to take out Zack, and moving forward we see her recognize the threat that Drea poses. Now while I think she tried to take a shot at her way too early, and I felt like she could have waited until the merge at least, I mean, she did at least have some initiative in trying to get the plan together, and she even had Tori be the one to try to get Roxroy on her side, but obviously Tori ends up leaking that Drea had an extra vote to Roxroy, which caused SWATI to eventually get a lot of the blame for it. But even then, she does use her shot in the dark at the tribal where she goes home, so she at least had some awareness about her spot by the end of it. So obviously there's some messiness involved, like the fact that she relied on Tori to try to get the Drea blindside together, the fact that she even tried to get this blindside going together this early in the game, and obviously, like, the whole number one thing, which isn't great and a bit messy on her end, but I can at least see where she was coming from there. So while I think there was a lot of messiness in her game, I feel like she has more pros than a lot of the people we already talked about, where she at least survives a tribal, she was at one point in a good position, and I feel like she wasn't as messy as JD, though still heavily flawed. So I feel like for those reasons, she is here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13. We actually have the final pre-merge bootlet to talk about, which does speak pretty well to the young players, as most of them did end up making the merge on their season. But we do have Spencer from Survivor Tokensheens, and Spencer was a pretty baseline player where he's not the worst in the world across any aspect of the game, but through his tribe losing challenge after challenge and getting rid of the clear pariahs in Carolina and Sandy, he just became like the next off the pecking order, as he wasn't really part of the core majority alliance at any point. And I feel like that largely explains his game. I feel like there isn't too much good or bad to say about his game, and with him being a pre-merge boot, he is here number 13. Now I'm moving on to number 12, and from this point on, every other player on this list made the merge, and actually made it pretty deep into the game, all things considered. But number 12, and I was a bit disappointed by how low this person was, as I think they're a better player than what their game displayed, but their game was still one where they were mostly in the minority. But here we have Michael YERGER from Survivor Ghost Island. And Michael's game was largely one of him being in survival mode, where for most of the game, he kind of gets unlucky with tribe swaps and being outside the majority in a situation where the other tribe was very much loyal. He was in a good enough spot early on in the original Malolo, being able to take out Gonzalez and Jacob, but then after the swap, he finds himself down the numbers where the Navidis were just simply not going to flip. And while he does try to get them to flip, and while he does try to do things to shake things up, like convincing people that his idol can be used on two people, a lot of it's ineffective, and through that, he loses a lot of his close allies in Brendan and Stephanie. And while he's able to get through the Jane's run alright after the second swap, he's pretty much in a spot to where he probably would have been the next one out had they ever gone back to tribal. And at the merge, it's more the same, where while he does vote correctly at the Chris and Desiree tribals, a lot of it's due to things outside of his direct control, where it feels like Dominic and Wendell are more so controlling the game than anything else. He also has to use an idol at the final 12 round, which isn't great, and even then is unable to get out Wendell, who was his target in that spot, where Libby goes out instead. And then at the final 10 is where we have the split tribal, where he was pretty much put at the bottom with both Dominic and Wendell. However, he does try at least to get a flip to happen, where he tries to convince people that he has an idol. You also have the fact that Kellen had an extra vote that she could have used to potentially take a shot against Wendell. However, it's pretty much unsuccessful and he gets taken out in that spot. So really, Michael's game is largely one of him getting unlucky, where he is in the bottom for so much of the game, mainly due to original tribal line sticking. And while there wasn't too much he could have done to really turn things around, I still think that Michael has some potential if he were to come back. I think he has some skills to be a good player. But if we are looking at his game, it's not one that's overly impressive. It's not one where he had too much control, which is a big reason that I can only put him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 12, and we have a pretty notable player to get into here. And Admittedly, I don't think this person's as good of a player as Michael, but if we are looking at their game, they were in the majority for more of the game than Michael. But here we have Purple Kelly from Survivor Nicaragua, and the main reason I have Purple Kelly above Michael is that she was in the majority for almost her entire run, where early on she was part of the majority group that took out Shannon. After the swap, she's able to stick with that group to take out Kelly B and later Jill, and then even after the merge, she's able to vote correctly at the Alina and Marty votes. However, I will also admit that she probably didn't have too much control within the game, where even among her own allies, like the likes of Brenda and Sash were more so controlling the game than her. She obviously is left out of the Brenda blindside at the final 10, and eventually she's in a spot too where she has to quit the game. Now, I will admit that she gets a bit too much hate for her quitting the game, and obviously with the stuff that's come out after the season, it makes sense why she caved in, where she wasn't given enough clothes, and through that she was pretty much miserable around camp. But at the end of the day, I feel like Purple Kelly's someone that didn't directly control the game too much, plus I don't really see how she wins the game even if she were to get to the end, but she was in the majority for most of the game, which is more than I can say about Michael, which is a big reason she is here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this is a player that was in the majority for most of the game, sort of similar to Purple Kelly, and probably showed more activeness in their game, but was also a bit more messy. But here we have LIANA from Survivor 41, and I think LIANA definitely played a competent game for the most part, where she was in a very solid position in the pre-merge, being closely aligned with Tiffany and Evie, that allowed her to be in the majority there, but she was also able to build a solid relationship with Shan during her trip to Shipwheel Island that basically put her in a pretty solid position coming into the merge, where she could have successfully ridden both sides, where she could have worked with Shan and a lot of the other black players after they formed a black alliance, while still having Yase on the side. However, she does kind of go all in on the black alliance, and she does it in a way that lets the other Yases know that she fled, which I think is a bit messy there. She also has her knowledge is power that she tries to use in order to get Xander's idol, but through the knowledge leaking, it allows them to counter that, which is not great there. But she's still in the majority for the next couple rounds, where she's able to pick off a lot of her old Yase members until the final 8, where it all crumbles around her, where the group decides to flip against her and Shan, with her as the backup target, but through that they take out Shan, and she's the pretty clear target the next round, where she does get a bit unlucky that Deshawn ends up surviving the do or die twist, but she was still at the bottom at that point regardless, and I feel like with the way that she played by making herself come off as Shan's follower, it made it so that it would have been very hard for her to win at the end, even if she got there. So while LIANA played more actively than a lot of the players we already talked about and played more dynamically, I feel like she was a bit messy, and I feel like she could have handled certain things better, to where she is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we actually have the earliest player left on the board to talk about, but here we have Frosty from Survivor China. And Frosty's a weird case, as he actually played before the age requirement was lowered to 18, meaning he was technically underage at the time. However, from what I understand, CBS decided to make an exception for Frosty simply because they wanted him on the cast. But anywho, Frosty played a pretty competent game for the most part, where again, he wasn't in the driver's seat per se, but he was in a good enough spot in the original John Who, taking out like a lot of the early targets there. After the swap, he is swapped over to Fei Long and put him in a pretty bad spot. However, he's able to build a solid relationship with the core majority group in Todd, Amanda, and Courtney, to where he's able to survive that when they go to tribal, and ultimately he sticks with that group after the merge. And I feel like he does a better job at hiding his allegiance compared to LIANA, where the other Zhang Hus don't immediately target him for flipping against them, but he's able to be in the majority there, taking out Jamie and John Robert, but then he's eventually sniped out at the final 8 due to him being seen as too close to Courtney. It's not a great game at the end of the day, but I feel like it's a cleaner game than what we saw with LIANA, and I feel like Frosty was a bit more active in the game compared to Purple Kelly, to where he is here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I kind of struggle with these next two, as both of these players made very deep runs on their season. However, we're not seen as very strong players at the end of the day, and it's just a matter of where to put them on this list. However, I did decide to put them here, which is why number 8 I do have Natalie Tenerelli from Redemption Island, the first of the 2 finalists to make this list. And Natalie's game is obviously one that's pretty underwhelming, where even though she makes it to the end and even though she is in the majority for the entire game, she kind of follows Boston Rob the entire time, never really making a move against him, even at the point at the end of the game where she had opportunities to do so, where we saw Ashley trying to get her to flip, only for her to remain loyal to him. And it's not like she had much respect either, to where she only wins in a final 2 against Philip, which obviously wasn't happening. And really, there isn't too much to say about her game, as really, I feel like Boston Rob was running a lot of it. However, she was at least in the majority for the entire game, which was enough to have her above a lot of these other players, which is a big factor in her at least being this high, plus the fact that she at least made it to the end, whereas the other players either got voted out or quit in one case. But at the end of the day, I can't really have Natalie too much higher than here, which is why she's here number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have a pretty similar player, although this person was at least more active in the game, even if they weren't super effective. But here we have XANDER from Survivor 41, the highest ranked runner-up on the list. And XANDER's another person that I have talked quite a bit about their game and how I didn't find it super impressive, where again, before the final 8, he doesn't have much influence in the game. He's in a pretty bad spot in the pre-merge, where he didn't really do much to save himself during the Voje tribal, and even then would have been the next boot had they ever gone back to tribal. At the merge, while he is able to counter the knowledge is power play, he is part of the minority in that spot, to where he is losing the likes of Tiffany and Evie along the way, despite being in positions to where he could have saved them, especially Evie at that split tribal, where he had both an extra vote and an idol that he could have used to save them. However, he just decides not to, focusing instead on self-preservation. However, at the final 8 is where his game starts to turn on a bit, where he does align with Ricard and joins the majority in blindsiding Shan. He's able to then keep Ricard around the next couple rounds as a meat shield, until he recognizes that he needs to cut Ricard at the final 5, and then he wins final immunity only to misplay the fire making decision, where he does recognize that Erica is probably the biggest trade threat on the board, but he incorrectly assumes that not putting in the fire will lower her win equity, when in reality she was probably already winning anyway. So I feel like throughout a lot of the game, while he was his underdog, he comes off as pretty passive, where he was in the bottom for a lot of it. He had opportunities to make bigger moves but simply didn't take them, and a lot of that contributes to why he loses at the end, where he doesn't get a single vote. I don't think he's the worst player in the world, and sort of similar to Natalie, a lot of the reason he's up here is due to his placement, where he did at least get all the way to the end, but I feel like the path there was kind of mediocre, which is why he is here number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person kind of reminds me of XANDER, except I feel like this person was definitely more active in the game, and I feel like they probably would have had a more of a shot of winning had they gone to the end, but were obviously taken out sooner. But here we have WAHL from Millennials versus Gen X, and Will is a tough game to assess, as well as he was definitely a very active player and someone that I was pretty impressed to hear talk about after the season. However, I feel like his game is a bit more wonky, where I feel like early on he definitely played pretty well, being in the majority there, was able to be in the majority on his swap tribe as well. But then we get to the Michaela tribal, which is very questionable, where he and Jay decide to target Michaela simply as a big move, and it doesn't really benefit their gains whatsoever, which definitely carries over into the merge, where at the merge round he could have been a target there had he not won immunity, but even then he's blindsided when Michelle goes home. He's then left out of the Taylor vote as well. But then he starts to recover a bit, where he is included on the Chris blind side. After that, his side does win out on the rock draw, and then we see him again trying to play more actively, him recognizing that he needs to make bigger moves, which results in him employing the pendulum strategy, where he tries to go back and forth, trying to play the middle while taking out big targets from each of the sides. And he is successfully able to blindside Zeke by doing this, but then by the next round he's caught and he is taken out himself at the final 8. Again, it's not the greatest game in the world, and I did consider putting him below the likes of XANDER and Natalie. However, I found them to be more active than those two, and I found them to be more effective than the likes of Michael YERGER or LIANA in this instance. I feel like I was more impressed by Will's game compared to those other people, which was enough to put him this high on the list, but really 6 is about as high as it can put him. Now moving on to number 5, and we actually have a pretty controversial figure to get into here, and the only returning player on the board, but here we have Brandon Hands, and this is his game from South Pacific, not his Caramon game. And Brandon is very very hard to assess, as on one hand, he was in the majority for most of the game, and really that's a big reason that he's this high on the list. He was a bit more active in the majority as well, unlike Purple Kelly, where he was a big factor behind the Michaela vote, which is something there. And I think another massive thing is his win equity, where he was one of the biggest jury threats on the board, where he would have won in an all-Upolu final 3. And all of those are a big reason that he is at least this high on the list. However, there are also some pretty big negatives that keep him down. Like, for one, you can clearly tell that he was going through a lot of personal issues on the season, and I feel like that contributed to the way he played the game, where I feel like it's a question over how strategic and how intentional he was with a lot of his game, where even on the Michaela vote, a lot of that could have been motivated by him thinking that she was going to be this Parvati 2.0, and mixing that in with his relationship with Russell, who worked with Parvati on Heroes vs. Villains, that definitely could have been a factor in him wanting to distance himself from her. You also have the fact that he's very religious, and Coach was able to play into that in order to get him to remain loyal to him for a lot of the game. And obviously, probably the biggest knock to his game is his boot round, where he does win immunity, but then he's manipulated by Coach and Albert to give up his immunity to Albert, to where he is voted out, which is obviously very bad. However, considering his position in the game, he probably would have needed to win out from that point anyway, and considering that Ozzy was about to return to the game from redemption, it seemed very unlikely that he would have been able to win out. So even if he didn't give up immunity, he would have been taken out along the way. So either way, I thought he was in a bad spot anyway, but obviously him giving up immunity didn't help matters. So obviously Brandon's game is pretty hard to assess, but I feel like given those big pros, such as the fact that he was in the majority and the fact that he would have won had he gone to the end against anyone other than Ozzy, is enough to have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person definitely lasted longer than other people we already talked about and people we will be talking about shortly. However, they were also a common target by a lot of people on the opposition, which was a big hesitancy for me. But here we have Baylor from Samuel and Nelser. And Baylor's tough because she was in the majority for most of the game as well. She was in a power position for a decent chunk of the game, but she also rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, such as Dale Wentworth and John Rocker, to where she was a very common target by the minority, where during the Val Tribal, she was part of the tie vote there, part of the split vote, and while she does stay due to Val not having an idol, it was still a very bad spot for her to be in. She was also a backup target during the John Rocker Tribal and the Kelly Wentworth Tribal, and even at the Josh Tribal, while she was kind of screwed over by Jeremy winning immunity in that spot, she was still the minority's target, to where that was a 6-5 vote. So she very commonly got votes against her, even though she was in the majority. But after the merge, she is very clearly in a power position, being part of the Fab 5 alliance, to where her and Missy were able to be in the majority for a decent chunk of the game. However, even then, I would say that John and Jacqueline were probably bigger power players there, and same thing with Natalie Anderson, but still, she was in the majority for a decent chunk of the game, up until the final 5, where Natalie recognized that it was too dangerous to leave both Baylor and Missy in the game, especially after Keith won final 5 immunity, to where Natalie decides to idle out Baylor in order to keep Jacqueline, someone that was far more likely to keep her in the game over Baylor and Missy. So to that end, Baylor does kind of get sniped out of the game. However, she also had pretty poor relationships, to where it would have been hard to see how she wins a jury vote had she gone to the end, and mixing that in with the amount of danger she was in, I feel like I couldn't really put her higher than number 4, but she still played a relatively impressive game. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I feel like this top 3 are all pretty solid players, and ones that play pretty solid games on their season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 3, I did decide to go with Julia from Co Wrong. And I think Julia is an all-around pretty good player, someone that played pretty well on her season, where she was in the majority for most of the pre-merge, being in a pretty solid spot on the original Beauty Tribe. After the swap, she's able to build good relationships with Aubrey and Scott that allows her to get through the Peter Tribal, although even then she's the secondary target there. After the merge, she's able to be part of that women's alliance that takes out Nick. Following that, she's able to basically ride the middle, where she still has solid relationships with a lot of the players in the game, but most notably with Scott and Jason, that gets her through the Debbie Tribal. But then we get to the Scott Tribal, where everything seems to fall apart for her, where Ty flips against Scott and Jason, takes out Scott, and then she's kind of left on the outs there to where she's a very clear target next. So it's still one where she eventually gets flipped upon and she does run out of runway, but she still played a pretty impressive game for the most part. She was in the majority for a lot of the game, and I was impressed by her maneuvering around different groups, which is a big reason she is here in number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this person was actually pretty close with Julia, as I feel like both of them played pretty impressive games. And while this person has a bit more flaws with their game, I found their game to be overall more impressive. But here we have SAMI from Survivor 43. And I feel like I've been a pretty big defender of SAMI. I feel like he played a pretty good game on the whole, where early on he was part of the majority group. And while losing Mariah at the first tribal wasn't ideal for his game, given that she had a good relationship with him, he's able to recover pretty nicely to where he is able to reintegrate and form a majority group there, able to take the power from the Ellie and Janine side. At the merge, he's able to basically ride the middle, where at first he's able to take out Ellie, but then afterwards he's able to build very solid relationships with Jesse, Cody, and Carla that allows him to be included on the Dwight vote, despite all of his allies being left out of that vote. But then afterwards he's able to stay in the majority there, continues to ride the middle, and then coming into the split tribal is probably one of his most impressive moves, where he's able to get Carla to flip against Jane's, despite Jane's being one of her closest allies. But through their relationship, he's able to get her to flip. But then at the final 8 is where his game does start to crumble, where he does kind of get caught playing the middle. That causes him to be left out of the Noelle vote, and then he's pretty much a consensus target at the final 7, though not before he decides to use his shot in the dark. So it's still one where he peters out at the end, and I actually think he did a bit more wrong to end up on the outs compared to Julia, but I still find his game on the whole to be more impressive, as I found his maneuvering in the middle to be more impressive compared to Julia's, which is a big reason I have him above her. But I feel like there's a pretty clear number 1, which is why he is here at number 2. And now at number 1, the young Survivor player that I believe played the best game on their season is CARSON, and this wasn't even close. I think out of all these players, CARSON played the most dominant and impressive game on his season, and came relatively close to winning as well, where he was in a very strong position on the original Tika, being able to be a key swing vote during that initial tribal to take out Helen, where mind you, he did have a bit of a misread in thinking that Helen had an idol, but he's able to remain in a good spot there. He's then swapped onto Ratu, where despite him being the only Tika member on there, and despite us seeing that other players had gotten swapped, such as Josh and Jamie were in bad positions on their new tribes, we see CARSON being able to build good relationships and find himself back in a solid position, building relationships with Lauren and Kane and Matthew even though now we know that he didn't trust Matthew, but Matthew never had a chance to act upon that. At the merge, he's able to leverage that in order to remain in a strong position, aligning himself with the Tika 3 in order to control the game, and successfully riding the middle along the way, all the while being the glue that held the Tika 3 together, where even though Jan Jam and Carolyn were actors in deciding the strategy of the Tika 3, they have both said that CARSON was the clear force behind that group. So I think CARSON should get a lot of credit for the strategy that the Tika 3 were able to implement together throughout a lot of the game. He is targeted to a degree at the final 7, but even then, Carolyn is able to play an idol on him. And while he is still seen as a big threat, he's not the biggest threat on the board, where we see that Carolyn was a potential target at the final 6, same thing with Lauren at the final 5, until the final 4, where he essentially ran out of runway, where he still had the chance to save himself through fire. And while he does lose that fire making challenge, he would have won a jury vote against anyone left in that final 4, where even Jan Jam wanted to go to the end in an all Tika final 3, thinking that he would win, when really it seems like CARSON would have won that. So really, CARSON played a dominant game and came relatively close to winning as well. I mean, I know that I've already talked about CARSON in more recent videos, such as my Survivor 44 player ranking, as well as my top 10 Survivor players in the new era video, but I still think CARSON is one of the most impressive players from the new era. And when we're comparing him to all the other players that were under 21 at the time of their seasons, he is easily the most impressive of that group. So because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. And I'll be back again next week with another Survivor video, so stay tuned for that. Big Brother 25 is starting up relatively soon, so I'll be doing coverage for that when that starts, so stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.